Back in February of 2022, LUMIX officially launched the GH6. Now, 2 years later of using this camera, I'm going to be giving you guys my unbiased opinion. Everything that's great about it, where it's fallen short, and officially answering the question, is it worth buying this camera in 2024? Now, before we get into talking all things about this camera, everything that I really love about it and all this stuff, we gotta start off with the price itself, which is the crazy thing about this camera. Being just 2 years old, the price drop is one of the craziest things that I've seen in the camera industry. When this camera first officially launched, it was around that $1,800-ish price range. And now you can almost buy this camera brand new out of the box for $1,200, which is kind of a steal if you think about what in terms of specs and capabilities that are in this camera. Now, you can also get it on the used market for around $1,000 or less, which is also crazy. This camera is having 5.8K up to 30 frames a second, 4K 120 frames a second, a ton of 422 all intra 10-bit options and long op options. So many recording options, even internal Apple ProRes. There is a ton of things that this camera can do. So if you're looking just for purely a starter camera for a budget filmmaker, this camera has a ton of specs. Now in this video, I'm not gonna get heavily into this video specs of this camera because there's a ton of videos you can watch about the specs. You can see the specs online. But practically speaking, let's talk about the physical build of this camera and why I love using it. So with the physical build, this is a sturdy beast of a camera. It's definitely a chunky, big micro four third camera, which I personally like. I just really like having bigger camera rigs, and this camera rig feels really, really good in your hands. Now, the first thing that I love about this is the flippy out, flippy up screen, which needs a better name, but that screen has been one of the things I've missed the most using the S5 IIX and using the G9 Mark II, is not having the flippy up screen. I think it's so practical in a sense to be looking straight down at your camera and your lens aligning with your screen and seeing what you're seeing. When your camera is off center just a little bit, you're looking off to the center while your lens is over here, and it can just kind of throw you off balance in a sense whenever you're filming. And I really like having a screen on the back. When I want to go super incognito camera rigs, this is one of my favorite camera rigs to rig up because I don't really feel like I need a top monitor unlike the S5 IIX and the G9 Mark II because of that flippy up screen. Now, my next two favorite things about this camera rig, on top of that, the front record button. The front record button is just something that's really nice, especially when you have your camera rig in your right hand and you want to press record. You either have to set your rig down, hit record, or awkwardly go around the rig and press record when you're using a top handle and your right hand is not available. The front record button is just a nice little button that you can just press and start recording. Once I started shooting more on the S5 IIX and the G9 Mark II, it's just something that I absolutely miss. Now, there's definitely workarounds. You can get a top handle that has a record button and different things like that. But it's a really nice feature to have, and it feels a little bit more premium and professional when you want to be known as a filmmaker. Now, the other things that it's worth mentioning is that this camera does have front and back tally lights, which I actually really like, especially from a content creator perspective. Being able to see a light on the back of the camera or on the front of the camera to know that you're recording is extremely helpful. And it's also helpful for your clients if you're filming any interviews. They know when the camera is rolling, and it can give them a cue when to start acting. Now, it's also nice because you can actually turn these tally lights off if you don't want them. Now, a couple more things that this camera has in terms of physical parts of the camera body. The first one is going to be a full HDMI, USB-C, which you can either power or record externally to an SSD. You have your two front function buttons, which I really like using for stabilization for the electronic and the boost image stabilization. And lastly is a CF Express Type B card, which is great if you want to record internal Apple ProRes and you need a weathered sealed camera. Using the S5 II or S5 IIX or the G9 Mark II, you can't record internal Apple ProRes. You actually have to record to an external SSD, exposing your USB-C and HDMI ports, making the weather sealed camera no longer weather sealed. So if you need a weather sealed camera and you want to record Apple ProRes, so say you're snowboarding or in the snow or it's raining and you're recording Apple ProRes internally into the camera, you need a CF Express Type B card because of how massive those files get. Now, before I touch into the autofocus realm and some of the other missing features and issues with this camera, the thing I do want to touch point on is the color science. Now, the S5 II, the S5 IIX, and the G9 Mark II have almost identical color science, and they're all using True Vlog. Meanwhile, the GH6 is using True Vlog, and it is a full Vlog color profile. The one thing I did notice though, using this camera specifically, is that the colors and the overall sharpness is much more softer. And then when I was doing a comparison test between the G9 Mark II and the GH6, I also noticed the viewing LUT on the GH6 felt inaccurate in comparison to the G9 Mark II. So when I inputted my LUT from my computer to my camera, it didn't seem as accurate when I put it onto my editing system and applied that same LUT. It felt a lot more contrasty inside the camera viewing LUT itself versus when I was just actually applied the LUT onto the camera. So it didn't feel like it was as accurate in comparison to when I shoot on the S5 IIX like I'm right now. I will customize all my settings inside this camera to make sure the LUT looks as good as possible when I apply it in post, and it looks almost the exact same when I'm viewing it. Versus the GH6, it kind of feels like it's a little bit off, but that could be some user error potentially. But every time I've tested it, it seems like it's just slightly more contrasty than what the LUT is actually doing to the image itself. Now, the biggest elephant in the room before I talk about the missing features and issues of this camera is the autofocus. I think there was some issue with us as the creators ourselves trying to push on LUMIX to release the GH6 as soon as possible, and it just wasn't ready. It came, I would say, a year and a half too soon, not having phase detect autofocus. Now, that doesn't mean the autofocus is bad by any means. The autofocus, I would say, is usable 80 to 85% of the time if you are filming B-roll. I would never trust this autofocus contrast-based system in interview setups. Now, with that said, I still used the autofocus a ton on the GH6, but there was still the consistent issues of pulsing, which is the lights moving back and forth in images and kind of pulsing forward and pulsing back, trying to find and lock the autofocus. And that was the biggest issue with contrast-based autofocus. So I just wouldn't be trusting it if you were doing any client work at all. I would just use it in a pinch here and there, but it worked. It was a lot better than older cameras like the G9 or GH5. It just wasn't right there because it didn't have phase detect. Anyways, let's get into the missing features from this camera and a couple issues. Now, obviously the first one I already mentioned, the lack of phase detect autofocus from this camera was probably the biggest letdown to most of the creators. Now, I do have a video coming out to this channel really soon, so if you've been enjoying this content, you should definitely consider subscribing. But I plan on making a video talking all about my future predictions of the next GH6 camera coming super soon with a special guest. Anyways, that video will be coming soon, but if you enjoy this content, you should definitely consider subscribing. The next missing feature that wasn't really introduced until the S5 II was real-time LUT. Now, I don't really use real-time LUT except for photography purposes. For video purposes, I've never really found a ton of needs for this camera unless I'm asked specifically to have color be burned into the image by a client. I almost never use real-time LUT, and I do think there's a couple upgrades to real-time LUT in the future, but this camera definitely was missing this new unique feature that LUMIX has presented in their newer cameras. And the third thing is the improved IBIS. Now with the launch of the G9 Mark II, it kind of was the upgraded GH6, just not in that cinema camera body style that Lumix created before the GH6, but it had improved IBIS with 8 axes of stabilization, improved electronic stabilization, and overall that camera is definitely more similar and closer to kind of the early day stabilizations that the GoPros were coming out with. And I'm really excited to see when Lumix Micro Four Third cameras get to the point when they are absolutely looking like they're on a gimbal. They're not there yet, but they are getting really close. Now, my last point in this category is really the only biggest issue I have besides autofocus is the streaking issues. Now, before I talk about my experience with the streaking issues, I would like to say in majority of scenarios, filming outside, filming interviews, filming almost anything, I didn't experience any streaking issues except if I was in a high contrast area. So a couple scenarios that where the streaking issues was prominent and noticeable to myself. The first one was when I was filming some black product and I was throwing some tennis balls into the image because it was for this bag company and this was tennis bags. And that is when I noticed the streaking issue come up because it was a high contrast area. Now in the second scenarios where I've noticed it, and I don't know if I have any clips on hand for this, but it was in the high contrast backlight scenarios. Now with the color grade applied, sometimes it's really hard to notice until you bring up your exposure level. So I wouldn't knock this camera for having this issue, but it's not great that it's there. So that's kind of my 2 cents about streaking. I don't think it's the end all be all for this camera. It's just in some scenarios you have to learn how to work around it or make sure those scenarios don't come up knowing what the issues are. Now finally, would I recommend buying this camera in 2024? Yes, but there's a little bit of a caveat on who I think should buy this camera. Now, the first person is going to be the budget filmmaker camera. Now, this is not the content creator who wants to make YouTube videos. If you want to buy a Micro Four Third camera with amazing autofocus for YouTube, I would get the G9 Mark II, and I have an entire review video on that. If you are more of a filmmaker though, and you want to make short films or make some type of commercials or anything in between, that is where I would recommend the GH6 II, is those type of people, especially people who want to improve the manual focus game, get used to pulling focus, which is kind of a skill that is definitely needed in the professional industry, is having someone that can pull focus and nail their focus reliably every single time. That is something you do learn using the GH6. And it's not something that you learn if you always are relying on autofocus and you're never pulling focus. And then the next 2 types of people that I would recommend this to is if someone that owns the G9 Mark II is looking for a solid B cam, or if you own the S5 II or 2X and you're looking for a B cam and you're not wanting to spend the price tag of the G9 Mark II, then this is a great solid B camera option. But again, if you are a content creator or you are wanting to become a YouTuber and you want super reliable autofocus, then if you're looking for a Micro Four Third camera, I would definitely recommend the G9 Mark II. Or if you're looking for a full frame, the S5 II or 2X would be great for you as well. Anyways, I'd love to hear all your guys' thoughts about the GH6. Do you guys still own it? Did you sell it? Are you waiting for the GA7? I'd love to hear all your thoughts. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you are interested in seeing the G9 Mark II versus the GH6, check out that video right here. And then YouTube recommends you might like this video right here. Until next week, guys, peace.